What if I told you a country just handed Ukraine a squadron of fighter jets, parked anti-ship missiles 300 kilometers from Russia's naval base, and signed a deal to eventually give Ukraine 150 of its most advanced combat aircraft? Now, what if I told you that country exports flat-pack furniture and has a national dish that smells like a chemical weapon? Sweden, neutral for 200 years. Bored of it. For most of modern history, Sweden ran the longest streak of military neutrality in European history. 200 years of sitting out every major conflict, nodding politely at whoever was currently blowing up the continent, and quietly building one of the most sophisticated defense industries on Earth, just in case. That streak ended in March 2024, when Sweden became NATO's 32nd member. The press conferences were very dignified. The champagne was probably warm. Somewhere in a Russian naval planning office, someone had a very bad afternoon. The moment Sweden joined, the Baltic Sea went from being a strategically contested body of water to something much more uncomfortable for Moscow. Before Sweden and Finland, which joined in 2023, Russia had real freedom of movement in the Baltic. After, the entire sea is ringed by NATO members, except for Kaliningrad and a thin slice of Russian coastline near St. Petersburg. Russia's Baltic fleet is now operating in what is effectively a NATO-controlled lake. And the lock on that lake, a rocky, wind-battered island called Gotland. Gotland is 170 kilometers long, sits almost exactly in the middle of the Baltic Sea, and has a population of 58,000 people. It's a popular summer holiday destination. Beaches, medieval churches, good herring. Swedes love it. Russia hates it. The island sits 300 kilometers from Kaliningrad, home to Russia's Baltic fleet, and about 160 kilometers off the coast of Latvia. What that means in practical terms is that whoever controls Gotland controls the sea lanes that NATO would use to reinforce Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in a conflict. Troops, ammunition, fuel, food, everything goes through those corridors. A hostile force on Gotland with the right missile systems could cut that off. Sweden actually demilitarized Gotland in 2005. It was a post-Cold War gesture, the kind of thing that seemed reasonable in 2005 and looks absolutely deranged in hindsight. 1 year after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, Stockholm quietly started reversing the decision. By 2018, the Gotland Regiment was reactivated. By 2025, the island had Patriot-class air defense systems, RBS-15 anti-ship missiles, and a dedicated armored regiment. NATO planners flew in specifically to walk the terrain and take notes. A Polish vice admiral who inspected the island in 2025 put it plainly. When you put a missile unit on Gotland, you can secure almost the whole Baltic. That's not a metaphor. The coverage arc of modern long-range anti-ship missiles fired from Gotland overlaps with Russian naval routes, Kaliningrad's approaches, and the sea lanes Russia would need to project force anywhere in the region. It's a geographic choke point with missiles on it now, permanently staffed by NATO-integrated Swedish forces. Sweden didn't just join NATO. It handed NATO a giant rock in the middle of a strategically vital sea. That's the kind of alliance contribution that military planners dream about. Sweden operates 170 military aircraft. 96 of those are combat aircraft. Not trainers, not transports, not the planes that carry the generals to conferences. Combat aircraft. That puts Sweden's Air Force at number 26 in the world for overall air power capability, ahead of several countries with much larger defense budgets and considerably louder foreign policy. The backbone is the JAS-39 Gripen. This is Sweden's domestically produced multi-role fighter built by Saab, and it has a reputation that tends to surprise people who've never heard of it. The Gripen is fast, highly maneuverable, relatively cheap to operate compared to Western fourth-generation competitors, and designed from the ground up to take off and land on roads. Because Sweden's wartime doctrine always assumed that Russian strikes would target conventional airfields first. So the Gripen was built to disperse across the country and operate from highway strips, forest clearings, and improvised forward bases. That's a level of survivability that the F-16 and Eurofighter don't have baked into their design. Essentially, Sweden built its air force on the assumption that the first day of war goes badly, which is statistically the most Swedish thing imaginable. It carries Meteor missiles for beyond visual range kills, Iris-T for short-range air defense, and the RBS-15 variant for anti-ship work. This is not a basic jet. It's also, as of 2 weeks ago, the jet Ukraine is getting. On the ground, Sweden runs 110 main battle tanks. The primary type is the Stridsvagn 122, Sweden's own upgrade of the Leopard 2. Alongside those sit CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles and the Archer artillery system. The Archer is a fully automated 155mm howitzer on a wheeled chassis. One crew of 3 loads the mission on a screen, and the system handles everything else. Firing solution calculated, wind and temperature accounted for, 6 rounds in the air, and it's already moving before the first one hits. Ukraine has Archers. Ukrainian commanders call it the best artillery platform in their inventory. Sweden's Navy operates 5 submarines, all built for the shallow, cold, high salinity conditions of the Baltic, and designed specifically to disappear in them. By all available evidence, they're very good at it. Sweden has never needed to advertise that. The surface fleet runs 7 Visby-class corvettes, built with radar-absorbing materials and a stealth hull shape that makes them genuinely difficult to detect. These aren't prestige ships. They're built to fight in the exact environment they're deployed in, which is increasingly rare in modern naval procurement. On land, Sweden is expanding from 2 mechanized brigades to 4. In military terms, that's not a reorganization. That's building a second army. Sweden's 2025 defense budget is 138 billion kroner. That's roughly 13 billion US dollars. Through 2030, an additional 170 billion kroner, about $16 billion, is already allocated on top of that. Defense spending is projected at 2.4% of GDP in 2025, rising to 2.6% by 2028. For context, NATO's target is 2%. Sweden is planning to exceed it by a meaningful margin, while simultaneously funding a full-scale rearmament program and sending billions to Ukraine. No 5-year studies, no committees reviewing the committees. The Riksdag authorizes, the defense ministry spends, and the procurement contracts go out, which is a level of institutional efficiency that will shock anyone who has ever tried to assemble a Kallax shelf without the instructions. The expansion is calibrated for NATO-style collective defense, not just national territorial defense. Sweden is contributing to air surveillance networks, standing maritime forces, and the enhanced forward presence in Latvia, the NATO tripwire force that sits between the Baltic states and any potential Russian ground incursion. Sweden showing up in Latvia with troops is not symbolic. Latvia shares a border with both Belarus and Russia. Sweden knows exactly what it's standing between. Sweden's total military aid to Ukraine has now reached 103 billion kroner since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. That's roughly 9.5 billion US dollars from a country of 10 million people. In February 2026, Sweden announced its 21st military support package, 12.9 billion kroner, about $1.4 billion. The package focused on air defense systems, drones, long-range missiles, artillery ammunition, and short-range air defense capability. Crucially, part of it was newly produced equipment bought directly from Swedish and partner defense industries, not surplus stock pulled from a warehouse. That distinction matters enormously because donated stockpiles eventually run out. Industrial contracts don't. Sweden is also embedded in broader NATO capability coalitions on specific weapon systems, which means its support is coordinated with allied production lines rather than operating in isolation. That's how you sustain a war for years instead of months. The Ukrainians noticed. By October 2025, they weren't negotiating aid packages anymore. They were negotiating fighter jets. On October 22, 2025, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a letter of intent at Saab's facility in Linköping. The framework covered a potential purchase of between 100 and 150 Gripen E fighters for Ukraine over the following decade. Then on May 28, 2026, Zelensky flew to Uppsala. They held a joint press conference at Sweden's Air Warfare Center, which is exactly the kind of venue you choose when you want to make a point without having to say it out loud. And Sweden handed Ukraine a fighter jet program. Sweden will donate 16 JAS-39 Gripen C/D aircraft from its current operational fleet, free of charge, to Ukraine. These are fully operational jets, already integrated with NATO standard weapons, Link 16 tactical data link, and Western IFF systems. Deliveries begin in 2027. Ukrainian pilots are already in Swedish training pipelines in 2026, using two-seat Gripen D variants for conversion training. Ukraine separately announced its intention to purchase 20 Gripen E/F aircraft as a first batch under the broader framework. Ukraine is financing the purchase through the EU's Ukraine Support Loan Mechanism, 90 billion euros, finalized in April 2026. Sweden will donate the C/D jets on the condition that Ukraine signs the E/F procurement agreement. Saab described the EU loan as what unlocks the practical financing for the deal. One Ukrainian fighter pilot, call sign Karaya, described the Gripen on Instagram as the only fighter jet in the world I'd be willing to sell my soul for. Saab has presumably screenshot that post and framed it. The Gripen C/D jets Ukraine receives are not museum pieces. They're fourth-generation multi-role fighters with Western avionics and Western weapons already loaded. Initial operations will focus on defensive counter-air patrols and cruise missile interception over Western and Central Ukraine, the kind of air defense work where Ukraine has been stretched thin since the beginning of the war. The E variant is a latest-generation Gripen with an active electronically scanned array radar, extended range, and network-centric warfare capabilities. Saab's current production capacity runs at 20 to 30 aircraft per year, and they're already reviewing expansion. If that full fleet of 100 to 150 aircraft materializes, it would reshape Ukraine's Air Force entirely. In November 2025, Sweden and a Ukrainian defense company signed a memorandum laying the groundwork to localize Gripen production inside Ukraine by 2033. Sweden is not just sending jets. It is trying to build Ukraine an aircraft industry. Missile systems went on to Gotland. The army doubled. Defense spending is now on track to exceed NATO's target through 2030. Ukraine received over $9 billion in weapons and equipment, including Archer artillery that Ukrainian commanders describe as among the best in their inventory. And 2 weeks ago, Sweden signed the framework for the largest single bilateral fighter commitment to Ukraine since the war began, with a path to 150 aircraft and domestic Ukrainian production by 2033. Russia's response to Sweden joining NATO has been the standard menu: diplomatic protests, vague threats about consequences, and stern letters nobody read. None of it has changed anything. Sweden joined anyway. Gotland got its missiles anyway, and the Gripens going to Ukraine. Sweden spent 2 centuries staying out of wars. Then it looked at what was happening 900 kilometers to the southeast, did some mental arithmetic, and decided that neutrality had a shelf life. The shelf life expired. What Sweden brought to NATO wasn't a checkbook. It joined NATO with a world-class fighter aircraft nobody outside aviation circles had heard of, an island sitting on top of Russia's only Baltic naval corridor, 5 submarines the Russian Navy cannot locate, a defense industry that builds its own weapons, and a wartime doctrine that assumes the first strike hits your airfields, so you don't use airfields. The civilian population of Gotland literally practices wartime readiness as a routine. Neighbors track who can cook if the grid fails, who has a water supply, who knows how to pass messages without phones. That's not paranoia, that's institutional memory. That kind of whole society readiness is something NATO has been trying to rebuild in other member states for a decade. Sweden never let it atrophy to the same degree. Probably helps that Sweden has spent the last 80 years quietly convinced that Russia was going to do something stupid eventually. They were patient. Sweden's contribution to NATO is force multiplying. It doesn't just add Swedish soldiers to the count. The Baltic is now a different environment to operate in. Assets on Gotland cover the supply routes to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Sweden's air force feeds directly into NATO's surveillance and command architecture. For Ukraine, that commitment runs deeper than hardware. Sweden is building a long-term relationship with Ukraine's air force, training its pilots, funding its maintenance capacity, and if the 2033 production plan holds, eventually helping Ukraine manufacture its own combat aircraft. That is not the behavior of a country that expects the war to end badly for Ukraine. 200 years of staying out of it. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and Sweden did the math. Missile batteries went up on a Baltic island. The army doubled. The defense budget for the next 6 years, 170 billion kroner. Ukraine got 103 billion kroner worth of weapons. And on May 28, 2026, at an air base in Uppsala, a Swedish prime minister and a Ukrainian president shook hands over a deal for 16 free fighter jets and a pathway to 150 more. Sweden didn't just join NATO, it joined the war, not with troops on the front line, but with Gripens, Archers, anti-ship missiles, and a 10-year plan so Ukraine can build its own. The quiet giant got tired of being quiet. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we don't do hype for its own sake. We go through the numbers, the hardware, the strategy, and we tell you what it actually means. If that's your kind of content, subscribe. New videos every week, same approach, no filler, stay sharp.